We're continuing our Theology Proper Part 1, and we looked at the basics on how to begin to use arguments for the existence of God. We ended last time looking at the concepts of proof, particularly the burden of proof, the burden of production, and the burden of persuasion. And today we're going to start off as looking at an important topic of levels of persuasion, because that's pretty significant because when you're going to use arguments for the faith at all, whether it's the existence of God, the doctrine of the Trinity, the deity of Christ, and so forth, you're trying to do evangelism and apologetics. At what point should someone change their mind? So that's a significant question that should be established up front. Otherwise, you could give the greatest evidence in the world and people won't feel a responsibility to actually change their mind and believe the truth. So once we do this, I want to look at the concepts first of certainty and doubt, okay? So when we talk about levels of certainty, certainty is really an epistemological term that has to do with the individual basically believing something which is impossible to doubt. True certainty means it's impossible to doubt, okay? And we call that something like axiomatic certainty or tautological certainty because that's true certainty. It's just, it's impossible to doubt. Now, truth is a metaphysical concept, and it really has to do with propositions that correspond to a mind-independent reality. So on this, so doubt is going to be something less than absolute or tautological or axiomatic certainty. But the point is that the way the entire world is designed and works in our evidence-based and fact-based universe is that you simply don't need axiomatic certainty to believe something. In fact, virtually nobody works that way, and what's importantly is most disciplines don't require axiomatic or tautological certainty for a commitment to that proposition as being true. In fact, so what's an example of something that's axiomatically or tautologically certain? Well, something like a unicorn has one horn or a triangle has three sides. So for that, it's significant that, again, these things are true by definition. It's impossible to doubt. But then as on or about page 17 in my Essential Christian Doctrine, Theology Proper Part 1 handout, I go through these levels of certainty. And so now we're going to look at some of the descending orders of levels of certainty and what to do about it. So when we look at the concept of axiomatic certainty, well, what's really sort of the next level down from that? Because only things like geometry problems and certain kinds of statements can be true by definition. So, if you're going to be a skeptic, a functional skeptic, and say, I'm not going to believe anything until it's certain, then the fact is you're not going to believe anything. And the fact is you can't even be certain about your skepticism, so you should stop being a skeptic. So these are the important sort of self-refuting kinds of ideas that opponents of Christianity will hold. But let's look at a few of these things with my, again, I'm a professor of theology and law. I teach courses in law, I practice in law. So when we look at evidentiary standards and levels of persuasion legally, they actually correspond pretty well with levels of persuasion for simply any belief that we would have. And what's good about using this juridical or legal methodology is that people tend to understand it, and it's established in virtually every courtroom around the world, and hundreds of thousands of decisions are made on these kinds of standards every year. Literally life and death decisions, trillions of dollars are at stake with these kinds of decisions. So we actually commit our most important areas of life to the presentation of evidence and the burdens of and levels of persuasion to these kinds of levels. So go one step down from absolute or tautological certainty, which means impossible to doubt, and we get to something that looks like what's called psychological certainty. And psychological certainty means that the individual holding the view simply has no more personal doubt anymore about that state of affairs, even though it's logically possible that it could be otherwise. Something like the sun's going to come up tomorrow, virtually nobody really thinks about that anymore or doubts it, or that the law of gravity is going to be in place 5 seconds from now. Even though that is logically possible, there's no good evidence to believe that, and virtually every person on the planet has a psychological or intuitive certainty that they operate on that say, you know what, I'm going to live as if it's tautologically true that the sun's coming up tomorrow. Okay? So that's the level of, when you think about it, that's the level you really want to get to in your Christian life, where you are so convinced of the faith, where you are just psychologically certain about it, and you just don't have any doubts about it anymore practically. That's why you constantly study the scriptures. You continue to study, again, polemic and apologetics to take care of all those counter arguments. And then you may have a great faith now, but you can increase the certainty that you have, which increases your commitment to Christ. And when your commitment is higher, guess what? You're more likely to do things based on that commitment. So that's one of the good reasons we do that. Now, the next level below psychological or intuitive certainty is one that's used in the United States for criminal cases. It's called beyond a reasonable doubt. And like the title says, it is really just that, is that if anyone raised any reasonable doubts, those doubts have been satisfied. There are no more reasonable doubts anymore about the culpability of the individual. Now, what this means is that the trier of fact is fully satisfied, entirely convinced, or satisfied to a moral certainty that the fact is true. And as we say, this is sort of the highest level legal standard that you can get in the United States. And what's significant about this is that if you are going to take away someone's life or liberty and incarcerate them, you want to make sure that and that's why we get to the moral certainty part, that if you are on the jury and you're going to say, yep, that person committed murder, or that person committed arson or rape or robbery, and you're going to put them away for a long time, you want to make sure that all of your doubts have been satisfied before you commit that person to death or incarceration. Because otherwise, you're morally culpable for not really thinking about the issue and sending someone to possible punishment for a crime they didn't commit. So this is why you want to any reasonable doubts. Now, that doesn't count speculation or unreasonable doubts. It means, you know, there might be a good reason here to continue my doubt that this thing is true. Why? Because, okay, you know, you said he shot him. We never found a gun. Okay, that would be some reasonable doubt. So how do you know, there might be counter arguments and evidence to offset that, but that'd be an example of a reasonable doubt that a trier of fact could raise. Now, so that's the reasonable doubt standard. And again, in your faith in the Christian life, it would be great that you have studied enough to get to the point where you've looked at all the objections to Christianity and you think Christianity is true beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay? But this is why we do, again, apologetics and polemic. Now, in between what's called the preponderance standard and reasonable doubt is what we call clear and convincing. And that's used for certain areas of civil law and estate planning law where it's below reasonable doubt, but it's higher than preponderance. And this is that the trier of fact is convinced the truth of the fact asserted is not just probable, but highly probable. Okay? So, again, it's not beyond any reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, but it's highly probable. You've given a lot of evidence, for example, that Jesus rose from the dead, that he really was God incarnate, okay? So again, it's not just more likely than not, it's highly probable at that point. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, like I said, when you begin your faith in Christ with your helmet of salvation, your diaper, and your bottle of milk, okay, the fact is you continue in your Christian life to study more and more to become a more mature disciple. And what that is going to do is give you greater and greater certainty that Christianity is true. And you will continue in your saving faith and in following the Lord and in your activities. So now we get to really where the rubber meets the road. And this is when minimally should someone commit to the Christian faith as being true? Now, of course, if you could convince them beyond a reasonable doubt or clear and convincing, the fact that is that, yeah, they should commit to being true because you've taken care of all their doubts. Now, by the way, back to saving faith, you might, in your apologetics and preaching and teaching and clarity of explanation, might give someone clear propositions and remove all their counter-arguments and defeaters to the point where they have to acknowledge this is true. But so there are a lot of people there right now, but they still just don't want to commit to the Christian faith. That's an act of will, and they have to want to trust God and follow God. So this is why, again, even though you've done good preaching, teaching, and apologetics, always give someone a commitment to right now, don't be opposed to God, trust God and commit to serving God, following God, and enjoying God. That's why a true prophetic ministry is calling people to truly repent and believe and to actually commit, not just to be a tare in the wheat field and to say, yes, I believe it's true, but I have no commitment. So, but again, more on that for our homiletic method. So we're at the concept of preponderance of evidence, which is the minimal level at which someone should commit to believe in something. And what is this level? It means that the trier of fact is convinced the truth of the fact asserted is more likely than not. So this is a standard for civil cases, and if you're sitting here with the scales, okay, scales of justice, right? If the facts, there you go, 51%, you win. $1 billion lawsuit, 51%, more probable than not, you win, okay? And this is where when you are witnessing to someone, if you're doing evangelism, you've presented your case for Christianity, if the person has said, something, well, okay, you've given me good reasons and this and that, you want to lay it out and say, yeah, but just be honest with me and yourself. Are you really thinking right now it's simply more probable than not that Christianity is true and this is the way the world is and the way a mind-independent world is? And then if they say yes, then say yes. Then if it's more probable than not, your other ideas aren't more probable than not, so why aren't you committing to this as being true? And so that you can make a case, that's probably the level where everyone should commit to Christianity or any of its propositions being true. And by the way, when our own people in the church are tossed to and fro by every wave and wind of doctrine, this is why pastors, ministry leaders, and teachers have to be able to do good apologetics and give the good counter-arguments, refute those who contradict, so people can get back to this level of confidence and certainty that that proposition is at least more likely than not true, so they can keep their commitment. So it's both for evangelism, it's both for keeping our people, our sheep, within the realm of the shepherd, so to speak, so they're not going astray. Now, what happens now when you're not quite at that level of preponderance of the evidence? Let's say it's only, it's below 50%. Okay, the scale's still weighing the other way, but you've given me a lot of good evidence and a lot of good ideas here. So what's the next step? Because now what I want to do, and part of doing legal or juridical apologetics, there's actually a couple of very important principles in law that have been discovered and used over the last almost century now. And first I'm going to talk about these evidentiary levels and levels of certainty, and then I'm going to talk about an idea in what they call tort law that's PGB, the probability times the gravity equals the burden, and apply it to the faith. And so let's move to, okay, probable cause, okay, as an evidentiary standard. What's probable cause? This means in criminal law, probable cause is where known facts and circumstances of a reasonably trustworthy nature are sufficient to justify a man or woman of reasonable caution or prudence in the belief that a crime has been or is being committed. Okay? Now notice this isn't a conviction. What this is see, this is the, sort of this is a stop and think for sort of, this warrants an arrest. Okay? In other words, I've got enough evidence now to believe that a crime has been committed. Well, this isn't the reasonable doubt standard. okay? This is simply, I have enough for a reasonable person, given the set of facts, to believe that a crime has been committed. So a peace officer can, again, do an arrest at this point, which means that you can be incarcerated, you got to go before the judge. But now, see what is that? That's a temporary stop and think. Now you think about how that would apply to the faith, is that if you've got probable cause to believe that Christianity is true, it may not even be to a preponderance of the evidence yet, but man, you've given me a lot of good reasons. So what does that mean? It means you better stop, and because it's so important, you should start doing a lot of investigation to see whether it's true. And that's what goes on with probable cause, and then goes on later to the concept of arrest and convictions, is that, but this is a minimal standard where your liberties can be suspended at this point, pending further investigation. So living life, okay, you should suspend that at this point and investigate further whether Christianity is true. And I'm going to apply this using the PGB formula, so it'll make a lot more sense. At the lowest level of certainty, below probable cause, is what we call a reasonable suspicion, okay? And what's a reasonable suspicion? It's a suspicion that's reasonable, okay? Got it? Okay, where's the laugh track now? All right, got it. So anyway, so what's a reasonable suspicion? Just what it sounds like, defined as common sense conclusions upon which people are entitled to rely. So it requires facts or circumstances that give rise to more than bare imaginary or purely conjectural suspicion. So here's where you might have a set of facts where it's like, I think somebody might be committing a crime here. Now, again, in criminal law, this justifies an officer to do a temporary stop, and therefore to do what? To gather more evidence. And the temporary stop says, okay, now I'm going to gather more evidence. Now, eventually, by gathering more evidence, they can get to probable cause and make an arrest, okay? But it's just this. It's a suspicion that's reasonable. So I'll give you an example here of a reasonable suspicion. This would be, let's say somebody is, at 3 a.m., is outside a jewelry store, walking back and forth in front of the jewelry store, then walking in behind the store and so forth. And police officer drives by, sees somebody at 3 a.m. walking back and forth around a jewelry store at night. You know what? That would be reasonable for the officer to think someone might be casing the place to rob the store. So what does the officer do? Gets out, goes and confronts the person and says, hold on here, I got some questions for you. And then what the person says is, all of a sudden he finds out that, yeah, here's a man who bought an engagement ring for $3,000, had the receipt for it, and he thought it fell out of his pocket, when he went out of the store. Shows the officer the receipt, and the guy just saying, look, I was trying to come here and find it because I realized in the middle of the night that I lost it. I was going to propose to my honey tomorrow. And the officer says, yep. Okay, I had a reasonable suspicion, but now I've got evidence that there's no criminal activity going on here. So they drop it. Or all of a sudden now you've got somebody with a bag of tools, instead a different person, somebody with a bag of burglar tools, pry bars and lock picks and things like that. And all of a sudden now it goes from being a non-intent or a conspiracy to commit a crime to now it goes to probable cause that now you're conspiracy, and go down the list of the crimes that are possibly going on here. So that's an example of how reasonable suspicion works. So what I'm going to do now is take a quick break, and I want to come back and go through PGB as a formula. So we'll come back in a minute and do that.